Hey guys, so we're going to do part 3 of SEO Trot. Just a quick review. We know that our characters are Mr. Hoppy, Mrs. Silver, Alfie. One of the problems is that Mrs. Silver wants Alfie to grow, so then Mr. Hoppy's problem is that he wants Mrs. Silver to like him. So what he does is he gives Mrs. Silver a poem of some sort to make Alfie grow. And what he does is he grabs a bunch of tortoises from different pet stores and he's like choosing them to specifically match Alfie. And he's going to be doing some stuff along the way to make Mrs. Silver believe that Alfie's getting bigger. So let's go ahead and continue our last part of the reading and let's get started. I'm going to share my screen with you guys. And there it is. Out onto her balcony swept Mrs. Silver. Alfie, my darling, she cried out. Mummy's back. Have you missed me? Mr. Hoppy, peering over his railing, but well hidden between two huge potted plants, held his breath. The new tortoise was still chomping away at the lettuce. My Alfie, you do seem hungry today, Mrs. Silver was saying. It must be Mr. Hoppy's magic words I've been whispering to you. Mr. Hoppy watched as Mrs. Silver picked up the tortoise up and stroked his shell. Then she fished Mr. Hoppy's piece of paper out of her pocket, and holding the tortoise very close to her face, she whispered, reading from the paper, as you trot, tag regib, regib, emok no, as you trot, work poo, foo poo, toos poo, nerps poo, wool poo, lows poo, egrog, elzog, foots, plug. Tupnotov, as you trot, tupnotov, tegno, elbog, doof. Mr. Hoppy popped his head out of the foliage and called out, Good evening, Mrs. Silver. How is Alfie tonight? Oh, he is lovely, Mrs. Silver said, looking up and beaming. And he's developing such an appetite. I've never seen him eat like this before. It must be the magic words. You never know, Mr. Hoppy said darkly. You never know. Mr. Hoppy waited 7 whole days before he made his next move. Um, On the afternoon of the 7th day, when Mrs. Silver was at work, he lifted tortoise number 2 from the balcony below and brought it into his living room. Number 2 had weighed exactly 15 ounces. He must now find one that weighed exactly 17 ounces, 2 ounces more. From his enormous collection, he easily found a 17-ounce tortoise, and once again he made sure that the shells matched in color. Then he lowered tortoise number 3 onto Mrs. Silver's balcony. As you will have guessed by now, Mr. Hoppy's secret was a very simple one. If a creature grows slowly enough, I mean very, very slowly indeed, then you'll never notice that it has grown at all, especially if you see it every day. It's the same with children. They are actually growing taller every week, but their mothers never notice it until they grow out of their clothes. Slowly does it, Mr. Hoppy told himself. Don't hurry it. So this is how things went over the next 8 weeks. In the beginning, Alfie weighed 13 ounces. End of first week, tortoise number 2 weighed 15 ounces. End of second week, tortoise number 3 weighed 17 ounces. End of third week, tortoise number 4 weighed 19 ounces. End of the fourth week, tortoise number 5 weighed 21 ounces. End of fifth week, tortoise number 6 weighed 23 ounces. End of sixth week, tortoise number 7 weighed 25 ounces. End of seventh week, tortoise number 8 weighed 27 ounces. After Alfie's weight was 13 ounces. Tortoise number 8 was 27 ounces. Very slowly, over 7 weeks, Mrs. Silver's pet had more than doubled in size, and the good lady hadn't noticed a thing. Even to Mr. Hoppy, peering down over his railing, Tortoise number 8 looked pretty big. It was amazing that Mrs. Silver had hardly noticed anything at all during the great operation. Only once had she looked up and said, "You know, Mr. Hoppy, I do believe he's getting a bit bigger. What do you think?" "I can't see a lot of a difference myself," Mr. Hoppy had answered casually. But perhaps it was time to call a halt. And that evening, Mr. Hoppy was just about to go out and suggest to Mrs. Silver that she ought to wait Alfie when a startled cry from the balcony below brought him outside fast. "Look!" Mrs. Silver was shouting. "Alfie's too big to get through the door of his little house. He must have grown enormously." "Weigh him," Mr. Hoppy ordered. "Take him in and weigh him quick." Mrs. Silver did just that, and in half a minute she was back holding the tortoise in both hands and waving it above her head and shouting, "Guess what, Mr. Hoppy? Guess what? He weighs 27 ounces. He's twice as big as he was before." "Oh, you darling," she cried, stroking the tortoise. "Oh, you great big wonderful boy. Just look what clever Mr. Hoppy has done for you." Mr. Hoppy suddenly felt very brave. Mrs. Silver, "Mrs. Silver," he said, "do you think I could pop down to your balcony and hold Alfie myself?" "Why, of course you can," Mrs. Silver cried. "Come down at once." Mr. Hoppy rushed down the stairs and Mrs. Silver opened the door to him. Together they went out on onto the balcony. "Just look at him," Mrs. Silver said proudly. "Isn't he grand?" "He's a big, good-sized tortoise now," Mr. Hoppy said. "And you did it," Mrs. Silver cried. "You're a miracle man, you are indeed." "But what am I going to do about this house?" Mrs. Silver said. "He must have a house to go into at night, but now he can't get through the door." They were standing on the balcony looking at the tortoise, who was trying to push his way into his house, but he was too big. "I shall have to enlarge the door," Mrs. Silver said. "Don't do that," Mr. Hoppy said. "You mustn't go chopping up such a pretty little house. After all, he only needs to be just a tiny bit smaller, and he could possibly get in easily." "How can he possibly get smaller?" Mrs. Silver asked. "That's simple," Mr. Hoppy said. "Change the magic words. Instead of telling him to get bigger and bigger, tell him to get a bit smaller. But in tortoise language, of course." "Will that work?" "Of course it'll work. Tell me exactly what I have to say, Mr. Hoppy." Mr. Hoppy got out a piece of paper and pencil and wrote, as you'll trot, tag a tib relams, a tib relams. "That'll do it, Mrs. Silver," he said, handling her paper. "I don't mind trying it," Mrs. Silver said, "but look here. I wouldn't want him to get titchy small all over again, Mr. Hoppy." "He won't, dear lady, he won't," Mr. Hoppy said. "Say it only at night and tomorrow morning. Then see what happens. We might be lucky." "If it works," Mrs. Silver said, touching him softly on the arm, "then you are the cleverest man alive." The next afternoon, as soon as Mrs. Silver had gone to work, Mr. Hoppy lifted the tortoise up from her balcony and carried it inside. as he had to do now was to find one that was a shade smaller so that it would just go through the door of the little house. He chose one and lowered it down with his tortoise catcher. Then, still gripping the tortoise, he tested it to see if it would go through the door. It wouldn't. He chose another. Again, he tested it. This one went through nicely. Good. He placed the tortoise in the middle of the balcony beside a nice piece of lettuce and went inside to await Mrs. Silver's homecoming. That evening, Mr. Hoppy was watering his plants on the balcony when suddenly he heard Mrs. Silver's shouts from below, shrill with excitement. Mr. Hoppy, where are you?" she was shouting. "Just look at this." Mr. Hoppy popped his head over the railing and said, "What's up?" "Oh, Mr. Hoppy, it's worked," she was crying. "Your magic words have worked again on Alfie. He can now get through the door of his little house. It's a miracle. Can I come down and look?" Mr. Hoppy shouted back. "Come down at once, my dear man," Mrs. Silver answered. "Come down and see the wonders you have worked upon my darling Alfie." Mr. Hoppy turned and ran from the balcony into the living room, jumping on tippy toe like a ballet dancer between the sea of tortoises that covered the floor. He flung open his front door and flew down the stairs, two at a time, with the love songs of a thousand cupids ringing in his ear. "This is it," he whispered to himself under his breath. "The greatest moment of my life is coming up now. I mustn't bish it. I mustn't blush it. I must keep very calm." When he was three-quarters way down the stairs, he caught sight of Mrs. Silver already standing at the open door waiting to welcome him with a huge smile on her face. She flung her arms around him and cried, "You really are the most wonderful man I've ever met. You can do anything. Come in at once and let me make you a cup of tea. That's the very least you deserve." Seated in a comfortable armchair in Mrs. Silver's parlor, sipping his tea, Mr. Hoppy was all of a twitter. He looked at the lovely lady sitting opposite him and smiled at her. She smiled right back at him. That smile of hers, so warm and friendly, suddenly gave him the courage he needed, and he said, "Mrs. Silver, please, will you marry me?" "Why, Mr. Hoppy," she cried, "I don't think you'd ever get around to asking me. Of course I'll marry you." Mr. Hoppy got rid of his teacup, and the two of them stood up and embraced warmly in the middle of the room. "It's all due to Alfie," Mrs. Silver said, slightly breathless. "Good old Alfie," Mr. Hoppy said. "We'll keep him forever." The next afternoon, Mr. Hoppy took all of the other tortoises back to the pet shops and said they could have them for nothing. Then he cleaned up his living room, leaving not a leaf of cabbage nor a trace of tortoise. So right here you can see they're off together. A few weeks later, Mrs. Silver became Mrs. Hoppy, and the two of them lived happily ever after. P.S. I expect you are wondering what happened to little Alfie. The first of them all. Well, he was bought a week later from one of the pet shops by a small little girl called Roberta Squibb, and he settled down in Roberta's garden. Every day she fed him lettuce and tomato slices and crispy celery, and in the winters he hibernated in a box of dried leaves and tool shed. That was a long time ago. Roberta has grown up and is now married and has 2 children of her own. She lives in another house, but Alfie is still with her, still the much loved family pet. And Roberta reckons that by now he must be about 30 years old. It has taken him all that time to grow to twice the size he was when Mrs. Silver had him. But he made it in the end. Then there's Alfie. All right, guys, so this is our last part of this reading. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I liked it very much. Hopefully, for the next video that I'm going to make, we can make another uh, activity that is similar or comes together with the book. So, have a great day, guys. Bye.